Hello everyone, today we briefly talk about the development of oceanic warships from the beginning of the 16th to the mid-17th century. Here and there I started to talk about naval history a bit more in depth. Of course, this is a promising field of expansion for Schwerpunkt. We need, however, some general introduction to get the fundamentals of what we're discussing. I believe that in order to understand a topic, you have to cover it in essence as in detail. And so, of course, the first introduction is to be really scoping also what you're basically aware of in general. And then you can start building up further knowledge through different, more in-depth content, in particular, actual strategy and tactics of single military events, and some broader criticism still, of course. So we partially discussed here some aspects already when talking about late medieval shipbuilding, naval engineering, and more. During the Renaissance, Europe was directly opening to the rest of the world, mostly in an expansive fashion, with the beginning of the age of explorations, of colonies establishment. That all stemmed actually from medieval civilizational push that had already started, especially from the mid 14th century, to make significant leap forwards, especially in Atlantic navigation along mostly the coast. As you know, there is a huge debate regarding who reached the Americas, regardless of sort of more important and notorious cases of Eric the Red, Columbus himself, and how much, in fact, other explorers since antiquity may have reached, especially the Americas. Actually, no continent had ever been fully isolated. We know it pretty well. Civilization did develop, for example, in the Americas also as a consequence of Pacific crossing in very in early times and further. And this is an interesting topic also from a strictly anthropological point of view when you lack the, of course, explicit historical documentation for these voyages. We just know that, and we could even deal with it elsewhere. But of course, what happens starting from the Renaissance is something very different, right? At this point, Europeans basically send some regular missions to take over different parts of the world, expressing, of course, like their broader moral, material superiority, succeeding in a couple of centuries to fundamentally take over the entire globe, at least from the sea, so forcing all the other peoples in the globe into some degree of dependency on them. I will make surely more videos about the age of exploration, but also properly colonialism and beyond, right, to explain this also from a military point of view, which is obviously fascinating. And it has, in fact, a little to do with sort of technological superiority or any other sort of deterministic and, in fact, materialistic explanation. It has to do primarily with the will and moral, scientific backbone of European civilization. In any case, from a nautical point of view, we witness in the Renaissance the Atlantic nations, specifically Spain and Portugal, representing the Catholic side, and England and the Netherlands aligning with the Protestant one, making significant investments in maritime navigation in a much more precise, pre-planned scientific fashion, which entailed, there are also other countries participating to this, a specifically military design of certain nautical technology. For example, the first country to really ideate, or at least to put into practice, the full distinction and separation of a military and a civilian naval engineering is Sweden, right? That in the Baltic was carrying out something quite interesting in terms of fact of maritime power, and that would in fact witness her further rise in the region in the following centuries. In any case, it's very important, as I just said, to understand that these undeniable advancements in sail technology, including the evolution from single masts to three-masted designs and increase in ship tonnage, which led to the creation of new ship models, is in fact more like the consequence of specific preconditions, contingencies, that of course did not reflect per se just the necessity of having, for example, a permanent navy. This is not, for example, the case even for land armies at large in the early modern era, at least until basically France of Louis XIV. Just yesterday I made a video about the British strategy of the 7 Years' War. The first one to basically conceive the necessity of a global naval power that could be wielded necessarily through a very specifically constructed instrument, that in that case was the Royal Navy. Of course, we remember the Clausewitzian paradigm as war as a continuation of politics with other means, politics that in this sense entails also the social dimension, also the same military one, but in a way that is rationally controlled, direct, wielded, right? So it's not technology doing the thing. There is no determinism about this. There is just a very strong effort and adaptation capacity developing under conditions of overwhelming pressure coming mostly from different countries giving a pretty tough time to one another, and in fact developing this means to achieve their political goals. When we look, however, at the naval engineering, we have to distinguish, especially in fact, what these means were created for. By the late 15th century, the carrack was introduced. This was an impressive vessel known for its elevated structures at both the bow and stern, and multiple decks allowing for the carrying of many cannons. Right? The concept was basically to create some multi-story fortress that could be loaded with guns, right? So giving more layers, like more levels of firepower, of course, from the top down, which is quite relevant if you consider like the habitual sort of kind of ships that had existed up to that point. We talk about galley warfare that, as you know, remains relatively originary and unchanged for centuries within the Mediterranean, but that's also because the ocean is a different thing. You need bigger, taller ships in order to withstand the winds and the rough seas that you can't avoid to escape out there. It's a bit what we've seen on a different scale in antiquity when Caesar with his Liburni on the Atlantic coast of Gaul meets with the Veneti that they're actually more primitive than the Romans, but they have this bigger, they're taller ships that can't quite be simply boarded, and they must be basically crippled by cutting their rigging, etc. That had developed largely in order to withstand, in fact, the bigger oceanic waves. The carrack is the further. There is all sort of different prototypes here. We're giving just a very basic manualistic definition, but still throughout the entire early modern age, we are far from standardization. This can be debatably extended even to, well, okay, there were classes at a point coming out, but say every ship is somehow different in a way still today, as every soldier is at the end of the day. For example, and so there were many hybrids and or simply other types that had come to configure themselves just also through sheer practice rather than some, theoretical abstraction of how a ship should be. In fact, the broader speed of technological development, albeit accelerating, is extremely slow, as you know, and in fact not that relevant, if not when you really look at sort of different civilizations, also quite spaced in time, you would say, in space throughout history, meaning that different civilizations go at different speeds and have different gears, and there you can perceive a strong sort of technological gap. But that is also not per se just the decisive element ever. We will see it better today. It can be the tip of the balance, but it's not 50% plus 1. In any case, you have things like the smaller caravel, which also had 3 masts, but was limited to a tonnage of 150 and tons, of course, and crewed by only a few dozen sailors. By the mid-16th century, the galleon evolved from the carrack. This new design was slimmer, longer, and sat lower in the water, quickly becoming essential to naval fleets. In general, the galleon was more compact compared to a traditional carrack, featuring reduced superstructure heights at both ends, and a distinctive bow with a forecastle and a ram, an addition absent in classical carracks. There were many hybrids also in this case, but this is interesting because it shows you how essentially the necessity of bigger ships had and would keep existing at least at some level, but in absolute terms had stemmed from the larger, from the pre-existent period where essentially the distinction between civilian and military vessels was not that necessary or important. You could simply arm the civilian ones as they normally were, also just to cope with piracy, for example. There was already a tendential diversion, but fundamentally with the later Middle Ages, we've seen it in different videos, stemming in turn, for example, from the famous mid-14th century crisis, that brought, paradoxically, to actually the increase in intercontinental exchange at smaller quantities, but say longer distances, and also in that sense, in interest of single expedition with larger cargoes, and also systems of escort. The Italians especially had pioneered that. Think about the Genoese, Maone, and other, and literal, tactics that were employed. We will have to talk about that, especially 14th century naval warfare in Mediterranean, because it's really that important. But also we'll come back on medieval one at large. Also, northern waters, where galleys were used, and this would be, we will see it better when we will continue the series about the Armada. But of course, it's not like a galley is simply useless. In fact, in oceanic water and vice versa. By the way, this is the point we're making before. Like, if you have quantity, at some point you can't top quality or specialty, and this is just a general strategic figure that you must decline to the respective situation. I mean, Alexander Farnese wanted to invade England from the Netherlands simply using some sort of barges just to land in the very shallow waters of the Thames estuary, some other areas around. So it's a sum of practical considerations more than a specific technology. The aforementioned galleons will specifically come to mark an era as a ship typology. Typically, in the 16th century, these vessels had only one battery deck beneath the main deck. That's how compacted they had become. The galleons adopted the ram feature from galleys and originated as a blend of the carrack, also referred to as the now, and the galley. Of course, again, this classification is somehow superficial. Many hybrids existed, again, that combine traits from the carrack. This aspect of the ram is quite fascinating, given that it was more like a spur, right? And we'll talk about this. Galley warfare had conceived like ramming techniques. We were talking about it recently, up to essentially the migration era. At that point, ships became smaller and they had less power, less draft. Consequently, it was more useful to try to break the superstructure, or at least some also still water level parts of the enemy ships in order to be effective and to try to still sink that. And it's fascinating that still in the Renaissance, essentially the ramp was there. And as we've seen also with the cataract, the logic behind all this is that these ships are, yes, they can smash into one another because that's something you can't physically do and cause harm. We'll surely make plenty of videos. I really want to make one about Lepanto because that's sort of the apotheosis of this all, if anything, for galley warfare. But of course, there is a lot of, instead of oceanic battles that are really fascinating to analyze in their kind. But the sense was still relatively medieval. Like the fact that you have to create a castle on water, floating up to the enemy, and essentially exchanging this bombardment in a time that against the structures too that were conceived to withstand firearms, in fact, could not simply be sunk just through bombardment. Right? There was a lot of not just of boarding still involved, but in many ways these structures were conceived to take a lot of hits, and not to simply be sunk by the first shot that they get. This is how essentially naval warfare has always been before and after this. So showing the more strictly military, say, human factor in the ship rather than any particular say refinement in a technology could simply solve the tactical problem by itself, right? Simply, there was just so much power that you could deploy. As we were saying before, with the bulkier hulls, for example, the greater tonnage, you could stabilize ships during bombardments because the inertia that this floating mass had could essentially allow you to shoot like massive volleys, like from your deck batteries, without influencing more than much navigation, or at least like causing damage to the structure, creating any other problem to the general handling of the ship. That, in fact, at that point is also not, it's such a greater firepower than before, but not able, in fact, it properly not still meant to simply like sink the enemy ship per se, right? You want to create damage, but ultimately you have to board the enemy ship in order to take it in a way or another. The rapid strides in maritime technology were propelled by the needs of oceanic navigation in the context of exploration as well. So the colonization of new territories, all these strategic and logistical challenges that derived from that. Of course, this expansion is really accelerating at this time. So there is actually a great naval development throughout the centuries, unlike in the previous ones. Yet, in absolute terms, compared to our rate of technological development, this was very slow motion. The military benefits of these changes became soon apparent, like large sailing vessels could carry artillery along their sides, as we explained, resulting in a firepower vastly exceeding that of galleys that had just essentially one deck, and they were just smaller, and they were conceived for a also way more coastal type of engagement. This is true also for oceanic vessels per se, but galleys, let's say, have many more amphibious options, right? For example, at the time of the Great Northern War, the Swedes had very advanced naval engineering, as we've seen, but the Muscovites of Peter the Great that had studied also Venetian galleys that were still used in the Mediterranean, decided to copy these better because they were cheaper actually. But in the shallow waters of the Swedish eastern seaboard, for example, with all those islets and gulfs and so on, at some point the Russians could ravage the Swedish coast without being basically exposed, at least at large, in those amphibious operations by the Swedish Navy. They could simply not reach that. Of course, it wasn't just about that. It's also not like that was a decisive element, but at large, it makes you understand how adaptable different types of ships really were. Galleys were used also in, say, outside of Europe, of course, with similar results. I mean, the Spanish that, for example, occupied Central America began to build galleys there, and this fared pretty well to a degree. Not only, of course, galleys, as you know, and not mostly actually, but still there was unemployment for functional employment for that. The introduction of gun ports along ship hulls to accommodate cannons in the early 16th century also marked the beginning of a new naval combat approach, which would dominate until the rise of steamships and turret artillery in the 19th century. So basically, you have to align with the enemy in front of you at a certain range, and of course, like just with a limited option in terms of what you can do. Essentially, most of it is pounding the enemy with sound cannonballs to smash the structure. Then, yes, you can chain them. You can use explosive projectiles, etc. But at large, right, the method will remain the same for a good 300 years. Once the potential of shipborne artillery was recognized, naval engineers focused their efforts on creating increasingly powerful vessels capable of supporting large caliber cannons. So bigger, faster, and with greater firepower, which produces also different types of ships that are balanced either in a sense or the other, but that effectively complement each other, right? They're all by type and number, of course, a reflection of the military needs that, as we've seen, were relatively, let's say, disorderly as far as, in fact, the uniformity of the ships were concerned. They didn't care about that. It was not so necessary, especially at the beginning of the era, right? For reasons we will explain now. From the early 16th century, the competition in naval warfare led to the development of colossal ships laden with artillery. That, as we've seen, was the beginning, the moment in which you can understand also why there couldn't be such a uniformity in navies as there couldn't be in armies, really. It's two different levels, because this is as if, I don't know, we were looking at, the development of 12th century castles. Just certain countries, certain more centralized feudal monarchies can afford the funds in the resources to build very specifically as strategically thought out bigger structures, let's say, that had in fact a bigger purpose at the regional level, provided that there were lots of smaller fortifications all around it. This is similar, right? Because in terms of land armies, we will talk more about these. I have something coming for the Tudor that here we are discussing with Henry VIII and his monster ships. Because of the, let's say, the greater uniformity of pike and shot warfare, the extension, now also the amount of troops that necessarily required this greater, let's say, uniformity of troops with the stat of compaction, with the general crisis of mounted warfare. So the concept of the bigger guy with other auxiliary forces not quite there. Naval warfare is different, because in naval warfare you're not building soldiers, you're building ships, right? Or at least, as we've seen, most of what really mattered was the actual Marines, the crews, because that what really made the thing, together with, of course, artillery that, as we've seen, is starting to properly be framed in a functional way in the pre-planned naval designs for enhanced functionality. But these ships themselves, like, are now, thanks also to the aforementioned power concentration of these early modern monarchies, capable of sort of having the bigger piece, right, and than the smaller ones. This is still true, especially for the early 16th century, for other powers in general. Like when we look at artillery, from the Mughals to the Germans, the Imperials, and we notice how they were still like in the wake of, say, medieval mindset, and also because these were pieces of something, not just people, are formations to organize, etc. This monster pieces then supported by many smaller ones, about which we also don't know too much. At least for that bigger monster piece, we have so many informations because everybody was bragging about this. They nicknamed them in a more distinctive fashion. Everybody sort of knew about them. We've seen them from trebuchet. We've seen them for the same castles were at times nicknamed in that way. Even the temporary, say, siege counter valations and things like this. There could be very big things, and for the first time now at sea you could do something of that kind. There had been other times in which this had been the case throughout the Middle Ages that had been similar, but let's say think about the Hellenistic monster ships and all the smaller ones that existed in a way. Here things are sort of coming back to that. This is very interesting because I made a series of videos about the notorious topic of Renaissance being fixated with classicism, right? So the idea that you had to reform modern armies that fought with pike and shot alongside the pattern of the ancient Macedons or Romans, right? And this, of course, remained. We really looked at this thoroughly. Aside from, of course, a general similarity that would come by itself in terms of the enhanced discipline and sort of greater unit control, very idealistic, all right? At sea, instead, paradoxically, it was something similar to what was actually happened in classical times. But also this wouldn't last forever. There's this first period in which sovereigns are fixated with it in mostly the first half of the 16th century. The Great Harry, this was Carrack, launched in 1514 for King Henry VIII. I made a video, by the way, about the development of the Tudor Navy and also coastal fortifications in England. In any case, this is another story. This Carrack served until 1552, because of course, also at the time, ships were decommissioned, and it weighed something like 1,500 tons, and it was equipped with approximately 200 cannons. So a monster, right? Naturally, those cannons, you see, in proportion, they sometimes were there just for figure. Even the number itself, like 200 cannons, yes, but primarily smaller sizes, right? This is the epitome, if you want, of that kind of floating castle with so many different guns and other weapons that, however, just literally like a floating fortress with not this great deal of maneuverability. That was the actual issue. Yes, there would be smaller ships that would accompany them, but sometimes these vessels were just a matter of propaganda or international competition. Those had the bigger one, right? And the emergence of the galleon caused, however, soon at least a temporary decline in this trend towards massive vessels, at least in a, we can't say doctrinal way, even though it's too much of a word for the time. In fact, this fashion or mania regained momentum in the age of absolute monarchies. At least, monarchies were never absolute. The only true first absolute monarchy was the Napoleonic one, with the Code Napoleon, where the state becomes the sole source of law. These were actually monarchies were heavily competing with the establishment to affirm themselves, but also through these means. And mostly, you would think, not much in the age, in fact, of absolutism, as we conventionally intended, but a bit before, the early 17th century, right? And this, again, was driven by both military and symbolic motivations. Of course, there was some partial functionality of these ships, but let's say that the bigger ones did not fare too well. Just to stick to England, the Sovereign of the Seas was launched in 1637 as the flagship of the English fleet. This is also why, think about the ship money and think about, this was a different thing, but the context of Charles I, of what happened later in the following decade, these kind of extravagances were also matter of political debate. And they were actually intended to spur the affirmation of some greater power. Look at what can I do as a king if I want. So if the country is actually that more autonomous from the king, how much can they do, right? It was a way to provoke and to get something in exchange. The Sovereign also weighed in at 1,500 tons. Of course, the Sovereign, the ship, not Charles I, and carried 104 cannons, which was a lot, and again, in a more functional way to its predecessor in the Tudor era. Now, the necessity of fitting such a large armament resulted in multiple decks with guns arranged in stacked rows, giving these ships a tall and formidable appearance, which often compromised their maneuverability and safety, though. Technically, as you know, having multiple decks loaded with guns, etc., was the future of naval engineering. However, this was not yet a time where the preconditions would render it simply available. So, of course, the pattern was the one we've already appreciated before. That is mostly trying to stuff this ship with guns, and the best way you could do that was also increasing the height of it. Except this would unbalance the actual ship and render it very difficultly handleable. Reason for which numerous large vessels from this period met unfortunate fates, including the Swedish flagship Vasa, famously enough, which sank on her maiden voyage in 628. Just as everybody on board was feasting, it was a disaster. As you know, the ship was eventually brought back to surface, and it is now displayed in an impressive museum in Stockholm, a testament of actually a major disaster, but still, of course, of essentially intact monster ship of the time. We made lots of videos about Gustavus Adolphus. We'll talk more about Vasa, Swedish warfare, also from previous times, including for the aforementioned Swedish precocity as far as this integration of firepower into actual naval engineering. Of course, when we look at the monster ships, these are very extreme outliers. The fleets of the time displayed a remarkable lack of standardization, with vessels of various sizes operating together without specific roles. This in part happened because of the different development of European countries. Like we often looked at least at Renaissance warfare at large, and we realized how, in spite of this broader idealism about the new era of modernity kicking in, whatever, actually most countries in Europe were fully medieval. They hadn't properly even demonstrated much of a power concentration from previous times, and even pretty large countries like even say England, for example, were very sort of lagging behind, for example, as far as terrestrial warfare was concerned, for different reasons. In this case, especially during the Elizabethan era, of course, the English were pioneering naval warfare in different ways. But we also have to realize the material shortcomings, like the fact that every resource was sort of stretched to the utmost. The Armada series is designed exactly to explain this on Schwerpunkt, and the contingencies for having first of all, like, enough resources for building concrete naval power were very limited, again, conditioned, so to say, and different countries had simply different needs, different approaches. Just yesterday we were talking this still for the mid-18th century, as France, for example, was the essentially tendentially hegemonic terrestrial power in the continent, in the old world, whereas Britain was heading towards this global naval policy that, however, was really at that point being just conceived, right, and only gradually applied. Again, very slow development, but when you look at the relative importance of these policies at the time, say during the 16th century, to go back to our topic, we witness, of course, like ships scrapped together. We're seeing for the Armada, for example, that were so many different ships taken from, like, made in Spain, Portugal, Naples, etc. So all kinds, right? For the, in fact, Spanish fleet that set sail in 1588 to invade England, we can enumerate galleons weighing between 300 and 500 tons, as well as larger ships exceeding 1,000 tons, carrying between 20 and 50 cannons, and crews of under 200 to 500 personnel, including soldiers. Similarly, the English, while primarily consisting of ships built or refurbished in the preceding decade, also exhibited significant diversity, generally boasting superior tonnage, firepower, and manpower. This is really important because when you look at the Armada at large, you realize this was a larger force and also a more articulated one from a power that was heavily invested, in fact, in a maritime, in a naval expansion, but with different social backgrounds and preconditions. The English were also fighting essentially for their own independence, because had the Spanish landed, was over, simply put, and they had been pioneering some kind of more qualitative strategy and tactics, as a bit like David against Goliath. We've seen also in the Caribbean, they had assaulted, in fact, with important success, Spanish galleons, trying there to do what? Like to just destroy galleons? No, to essentially prevent large amounts of wealth extracted from America reaching Spain, and delaying in turn in this way actually the Spanish offensive towards England. And now Philip II had decided. So you understand how, in fact, politics uses the military instrument for very specific purposes. And when you look at, the 1588 campaign, the sense is that the English were actually the weaker side at large. Not so, the odds were relatively balanced, but the fact is that the English had thought out their military instrument, this naval instrument, more recently, more ad hoc, not with, say, a power strategy, but, say, again, a qualitative surgical one of some sort. And this had brought to a greater uniformity compared to the Spanish Armada. In fact, it had been put together sort of quickly and with sort of some haste in a broader strategic hindsight, and that had not really thought to to homogenize, to blend into fur, because it costs so much. If you really wanted to invade England, you could do that. You had to simply punch that hard. And yes, these other sort of reforms would have helped, but they would have also, in interest of time, been unsatisfactory for that specific political and strategic goal. So that's why you have, for example, the English on average having, again, superior tonnage, firepower, and manpower on their ships, but at large also because they were actually the weaker side, and they successfully managed to essentially exploit the Spanish weaknesses that, in many ways, of course, always entails luck, right? No winner does so without that. It's evident that ocean-going warships required considerable investment, which helped explain why, in the absence of major technological strides, they remained operational for extended periods. Some English vessels that contributed to the defeat of the Invincible Armada in 1588 continued service for 90 more years. And why? Because they were so top-notch? No, because also for that, but also because, once you had a ship of that kind, like, the investment itself just justified the fact that you had to use it, and only when, consistent, 90 years, of course, naval engineering would have increased in very competitive ways. You would have to realize that just the ships that would also perish themselves, etc., were made before were not expandable anymore. But speaking of the Armada, there is no doubt that had the the weather been a bit more clement, it's possible that the Spanish would have taken over England. And so it's not, as you understand, just about what kind of fleet, what kind of ships. It's also about morale. It's also about leadership. In that case, it's never just about the weather. However, in naval warfare, that does, especially this time in history, mean a lot. Additionally, such large-scale and enduring investments necessitated heightened involvement of public funding. Again, there wasn't an homogeneous, regular, steady way of funding naval development, or even just to pursue a coherent, a strategically coherent naval policy. We've seen it even yesterday again in the video about the British strategy of the 7 Years' War. At some point, you would need to, interact with a hostile country by not going at full war with them. You didn't necessarily have to target enemy shipping. This all, of course, influenced the way even just a pre-existing navy would develop. Of course, at this point there was, we'll talk better about this, probably a cluster, a core of, Stattle ships, we can so say. Historically, the more coherent one probably created a navy was Venice, right? We can't, here it depends on what we're talking about, towards the second half of the 17th century. Indeed, when you look at England or the Netherlands, you see there just a Stattle navy that's employed in sort of also very traditional ways to a degree, especially by the Dutch, but with very good overall control. But let's say if you want to dig into the actual separation of the army from the navy at large, the establishment of the latter, we have to look at Venetian history, and we will better at some point. Because still, and this is very important to stress, for example, a power like Venice until the end of the siege of Candia was essentially a naval superpower and a superpower in general. So we're looking at navies that are that competitive while still largely maintaining galley-based, or at least at that point the Venetians were starting to get, in fact, Northern European ships, the so-called Armata Grossa, as opposed to the Sottile one, which means the bigger, the thin, the small one. But up to that point, in fact, the latter had been prevalent. There had been more galleys than anything, and other powers would keep using them even up to the 19th century. So it's fascinating. It really depends on what you have to do with that. If you are a small barbarian power, for example, of North Africa, you will keep going on with that, even with small amounts, because that's what you need at the end of the day. Then, of course, especially during the 19th century, things start changing to the extent that from a military point of view, especially in the Victorian era, you can simply have such a crushing naval power to control entire stretches of seas, blockading other navies, etc. Something at this point was not feasible, and therefore allowing for this diversity of ships existing, continuing. There was probably no need for uniformity, because still, again, the important was having something that floated, was overall updated, and there weren't such, strictly calibrated and, say, clock orderly tactics, etc., that could allow you such sophisticated and refined employment, for which you needed a certain uniformity, like in later times, say, look at the battle, like look at the Royal Navy at the 18th to the 19th century. It's another story, right? But even there, right, before the 7 Years' War, the Royal Navy was not even this enormous much, this enormous deal, at least as would be more famous, and deservedly so, especially later. There's a great primitivity, and objectively, also from a strategical point of view, navies had not been that important at large. They had historically been militarily relevant, mostly for supporting land forces, and in many ways they still are, in this era, right? Except their, again, oceanic range, that in that sense fit more like a military function, but an escort of broader expeditions, right? Of larger shipping of cargoes, and not quite because they were meant to engage in the midst of the ocean, which would have also been quite complicated to simply do with the technology of the time. How do you even intercept them? You have to wait at least for them to be on the coast or around there. Now, governments increasingly took control over the construction and management of their arsenals, though. Right? That's why you mentioned Venice before, because the arsenal, as you know, in the Serenissima is essentially the first, properly modern, fully centralized and developed naval arsenal in the world, and with an excellent administration and this crystal connection with very, in fact, compact and regulated Venetian government that made the success unavoidable of the Venetian Navy historically. But in this rampant growth, especially of Northern European powers, you can document better the in-theory work. Right? Venice had been such a naval power for such a long time. These other ones were just beginning, right? But they were also doing it at an ever bigger scale and acceleration. So you can also, from a strictly historical point of view, trace these political directions in a ever more, significant, positive, thought-out fashion. The same went for shipyards, cannon foundries, all that could, of course, reinforce the Navy, establishing administrative entities responsible for fleet oversight as well. Ships cost a freaking lot even just to be upkept, right, to be maintained. They rotted if you just left there. Just look at the scrap force that the Ottomans cyclopically managed to put together after Lepanto. The Christians didn't press on Constantinople. These ships remained rotting in all the ports of Levant. All right. While many warships remained privately owned, which was also a medieval legacy, the concept that the state should retain a permanent fleet of its own ships had already begun to take hold, making the decisions regarding shipbuilding a matter of political significance. Privateers were all over the place. I made a video about that, from the Middle Ages to Napoleon, and they were useful, if anything, for political, international, diplomatical reasons, because you could simply send these rogues of the sea to harass other countries and essentially causing a proxy war without being directly involved. This, as we've seen also yesterday, was true from a terrestrial point of view. If for example, you had militias in a colony, and you hadn't sent in regulars, and you wanted to harass another colony or another country, you could simply let this, these guys or the natives combined to take care of that frontier war. It was not so effective. But what is interesting is that European powers are starting to send regulars overseas, which is a hugely contentious political issue. It's mostly an 18th century thing, as we saw yesterday. Again, that video is so dense, I always repeat it. But it's really quite spot on. I didn't really choose today's topic on the basis of that, but it happens that you have this very deep intertwinement in such fashion. And as we said before, it was already essentially an amount of public ships, or in some ways, were basically turned into the Stattal Navy, the Royal Navy, that were just under the command, like of the sovereign and the government, the respective officials deputed to the implementation, of course, of those policy through naval strategy. It would be erroneous to think that the introduction of shipborne artillery instantly transformed naval combat techniques. Also, the implementation of cannons and the synchronization of gunfire within a fleet presented significant theoretical and practical obstacles. Just think a rough sea. This would be an issue also in much later times. How do you engage, right, an enemy? This is a problem amplified even just by by distance, by range. Meaning, yeah, you can have pretty precise weaponry, but if the sea moves, you can't stop the sea to make it still and fire. This requires sailors a considerable amount of time to innovate effective solutions that mostly were not technological and had, or at least they were technical in many ways, but they got down again to this still very brutally primitive ways to essentially board the enemy in a way or another and mostly settle the matter that fashion, because again, sinking a ship was not that easy. It wouldn't be for sort of a long time, especially of course this could blow up now with gunpowder inside, but at large, right, the necessity of taking out a ship like that first of all was not necessarily primary. Secondly, if you really wanted to achieve that, you had to sacrifice from your own side a certain effectiveness that, as we've seen, was mostly aiming at shattering the ship structure and also causing this mostly psychological, even before than physical damage to the enemy crew, the enemy troops on board. During the Spanish attempt to invade England, the long-range artillery's effectiveness proved limited, right? With many still advocating for the dominance of ramming and boarding strategies. The reason for that, by the way, being what we said before, that is, that say just sheer numbers, or just a different weather condition could change so much that in hindsight, a long-range artillery effectiveness was not the primary thing. The English fleet, notably, which led the way in developing theories around long-range cannons, would themselves likely not have triumphed over the Spanish fleet without the benefit of favorable weather conditions. And the reason why they were pointed so much on long-range engagements was primarily their own strategic and political concerns. They couldn't afford to lose ships. They were fighting against a more concentrated enemy, so they had to be the harassers of the situation. It's something we've seen also on the battlefields of the 30 Years' War, just half a century later. and not even, right? So it's not that far away conceptually. We've seen the bit like also the Protestant propaganda myth that the Dutch would have, found out this great solution or at least tendency to solve back and shot warfare. They essentially fought just like the Spanish. They were also better than them, as the 80 Years' War in open field proved. The same went for the consequences of the Dutch school adoption in the northern German. These Protestant powers during the 30 Years' War were wiped the hell out by the Catholics. This is truer for the Swedish instead, that however, in order to take on the bigger imperial and Spanish armies, they really had to increase the quality of their armies, which was also a political thing in many ways. Look at all the money that the French sent them to literally create an army could be able to intervene from Scandinavia. Also, there some aspect, otherwise the Swedish army being very primitive up to that point, as we noticed. And so you understand that this necessity to harass, to pick on the bigger one, is not just, yes, David is really stronger than Goliath, more often than not, when you look at it. But it is in relative terms. It can't win, as the same biblical story goes, in an absolute sense, but in interest of, because of course there is moral point, there is faith and more, and it's not like there aren't on the battlefield, but more often than not, the bigger one is actually the guy that knows how to make war at that scale, which is more advanced and better at large, so he can be defeated. Military history is really replete with examples of this. But in relative contexts where, for example, their capacities are not fully deployable because, say, the context is not so worth it. Look at, I don't know, the United States and Vietnam. Aside from the fact that they won every single battle of the war, in general, like the way that this force would be spent was not felt, if anything, at least by the decisive moral majority of the Americans. And aside from military mistakes were done, it's not like the United States military had much to learn in absolute terms from the one of North Vietnam, right? It's ridiculous to think so, a third world country against the greatest world power. And people have difficulties in understanding this, and especially when it comes to early modern warfare, there is this notion that it's just, this Protestant country springing out of nowhere and beating everybody. It didn't really happen like that. And just even the simple balance of European power shows you throughout the ages that, in fact, there was a balance that was really filled by countries that, while not particularly as equally, say, overrepresented in pop culture, mostly the countries like England that won, like the 7 Years' War, for which we have, of course, a British Empire that informed our popular culture at large, were, deserving much credit and admiration for the military. Unfortunately, contemporary pop culture, even less the YouTube one, I think, has much of a notion of this. But it's say warfare is interesting because victory and defeat are actually relative. This is yet another thing that people do not understand. You can have a war in which everybody loses, like the aforementioned Vietnam War. There wasn't a single winner out of the Vietnam War, and it's not a metaphor. Many people say it's a metaphor because actually there are winners and losers. Not if you're a Clausewitzian, if you know that, again, war is just an instrument. It's animated, it's controlled, and it's directed by an agent that is also, in fact, the military, the social one, but it's politically directed. And you can lose a war in conventional terms, but still, I don't know, like, for you, not being a big deal, whereas for the other being a big deal, if this is, say, a smaller country, for example, is fighting for independence of some kind of, say, against threat of annihilation. At the same time, you can have also big defeats for big powers, and so, of course, there are pretty serious issues deriving, more often than not, actually, wars for everybody involved. But again, I understand partisanry, but let's say not in the moment in which it distorts historical accuracy, objectivity, and method to begin with. And unfortunately, that this is what most people are. I realize it even just from Schwerpunkt. Most people just come here because they think that I'm talking about what they identify with and cheering for certain strange teams that they want to identify in the past just the way they want. This is what basically YouTube is entirely about, regardless of what you actually put out there. I must say that channels in general do not make a great job in preventing this. On the contrary, they're quite eager to sell themselves for that purpose, for the sake of views. As you know, I'm a bit different, but I think I do it also for the better reason. I wouldn't say the right reason just per se, but one must understand what warfare is, otherwise they're less than a child, like in terms of moral and scientific development. In any case, while advancements in technology and tactics were gradual, European ocean-going vessels were already positioned to outmatch those, for example, from the Islamic nations in the Far East by the early 16th century. This is a good example of what we were saying before. Also in here, we can't see simply like ships per se as, or say the technology behind them, firepower, etc., as the decisive matter, but they were the tip of the balance in a struggle that saw the Europeans so much better equipped just by background than these others. And we talk mainly from a moral point of view. It's not like there was another reason for which the Europeans took the sea and started conquering the world. They were simply morally superior. There's no other way to put that. Like, everybody could do that. Everybody could start with that and go on. The Europeans are the only ones who actually made it, and that consequently developed the means to achieve it. For example, as early as 1502, Vasco da Gama decisively defeated a large Islamic fleet off the coast of Malabar in India, utilizing only the artillery of his Portuguese carracks and caravels. This is relevant because there were at times different ships joining even from other places that the same Europeans adapted to local, especially amphibious tactics, etc. But they were so much advanced and superior in many ways. I made a video about Abyssinian warfare of the same period. We've seen how, like in this case, the Portuguese were so involved to defend the Christians in the Horn of Africa against mostly the Somalis, other Islamic powers. Not just for that, like there was, of course, the Ottoman Empire on the scene, etc. And you have a lot of, notion like know-how, sharing, military advisors, and so on. But you understand the Ottoman Empire being a good example that, yes, you can adapt a lot, you can westernize so much, also because you literally stem from the same Roman lands. But like, if your political and social fabric, much of which in fact was a Byzantine background, like, was less fruitful and productive than European one, there was a few you could really do about it. And so it wouldn't make sense to say that the Ottomans weren't strong or powerful, but they were in a way that reflected still certain limitations, and otherwise like also certain things in which they were superior to Europeans. It's just a broader balance. Again, the idea, people are obsessed with sizes in terms of, look at how big this power on the map actually is, but they completely fail to understand what it means to be a power. Like, they've seen it for the Middle Ages. Essentially, people look at medieval maps as if they were looking at 19th century nation states. They completely fail to realize that, say, even a city-state could be as powerful as a regional kingdom, and the first reason being not just being ignorant from a historical point of view, but literally lacking the most elementary political and strategic literacy. In any case, it's from this moment in history that naval fleets began to play a critical role in establishing Western dominance, as evidenced by the aggressive establishment of the first colonial outposts. Control the sea, you can hardly be dislodged from whichever place you settle in. Right? This is something that, for example, the Europeans showed, for example, the Byzantines and the Arabs the hard way already in the High Middle Ages. If you don't have a permanent navy sort, like it was at the time the case, except for the Italian maritime republics that in fact were the only ones to play this game, how do you actually besiege a port from land, right? A citadel from land that can host, like if the other guys have a navy that can constantly resupply this place, right? Of course, must have the political motivation, etc. Like that's crucial. That's always the point. Remember that there is nothing deterministic about it. In fact, the Ottomans overwhelmed these, as we were noticing before, also about this sharing of knowledge, etc., with other powers, with Venice, with France, and so on. Thus, we look at always a delicate balance that must be primarily politically understood. With the expansion of European power across the seas, a new type of naval warfare thus emerged, like referred to as privateering, mostly, originally synonymous with the concept of raiding, something again belonging to the Middle Ages because of the lack of a more cohesive state that unavoidably witnessed even the same major naval powers to emerge from actually private enterprises. It's what we were saying before about Venice or Genoa that could essentially create the imperial, the Spanish fleet that destroyed the Ottomans at Lepanto. These were originally, at least in the more normal places, like retinues of the major local houses that would normally increase the size of these privately owned fleets just out of the sheer income that they made out of that sort of blackmail policy against bigger powers to squeeze, and that had therefore so many galleys that the commune could simply say, okay, well, in case of war that involves everyone, or at least the majority, let's say, of our city, because some would try also to be on the other side, we decide that we put together some of these galleys so that we can send it as the communal navy against somebody. This is essentially, there are some, think about the Victual Brothers in the Baltic. Think about, in fact, these areas that remain still very primitive, very private, very fragmented, where there is in fact much law nor order, and therefore you can't take these people, because this is what it gets down to at the end of the day, that since are constantly war bending, in this case raiding, right? It's something dating almost to the Viking era, or even before. They're sort of always good enough in terms of quality. I mean, it's not like they're excellent fleets or whatever, but say the crews and the people who participate in this are exactly the kind of scum that will make it, right? That costs few enough, because this is not a state that it's simply selling you like service for astronomic ciphers, but it's something that you can send also just in small groups to harass this and that place, and all together they do make background noise. They do increase entropy. If you are, say, I don't know, a country like France or Spain, even say considering the extension of the coastline, right? Also colonially speaking, it's virtually impossible to defend this entire thing. Pick the Ottomans, for example, with Italy, that has 3,000 kilometers long coastline. How do you just think about the sheer costs of building? In fact, all those Martello towers that were exported eventually from Italy to, like saying, Britain and the American colonies, etc., to defend the coastline. like having forces that can control. This had been a huge issue since ever, and especially in this sort of pre-industrial context where, again, the state still doesn't have like a capillary control of the territory in an absolutely sealed fashion. And so there is always room for piracy, for brigandage, and you can't simply hire some guys and make them de facto privateers. This is what it gets down to. And eventually you will discharge them. It will keep being pirates, etc. We'll talk more about pirates at Similia, because it really belongs to this great tapestry of military history, of naval history, that really opened the way to so many avenues that at least the regular navies were a bit too expansive, if anything, to stain their hands with, or to wear themselves out with. So that, of course, the art of war is pioneered by the bigger powers that know deal better, but there is always this gray area that is very difficult and mostly fruitless to control, unless there are big motivations that will attract these mosquitoes, these flies, earlier, right? But then we're talking about, the precious metals of the Americas in areas that will eventually not even have this clamorous success later on as countries, in part because of this destabilization, this lack of order, this lack of state, and the fact that colonies were, of course, second-rate possessions at large, from an individual point of view. While piracy has long been a presence in the oceans, this scenario introduces something relatively distinct. That is, state-sanctioned operations by private individuals allowed to arm their ships in search for enemy prizes. We've seen this well with Hawkins, Drake in Elizabethan times. We've seen, in fact, money spent by probably the royal purse to finance these guys in concert with, for example, royal forces and, let's say, private royal forces, put in this way, and the ones of the kingdom at large. So just think the political interplay between these. Like, there is an establishment that is resistant, doesn't want even just too much royal power concentration. Then you have these rogues that kind of understand, however, better what naval warfare is going to become, and that are worth being invested on, but it's still a risk because war is a gamble by definition. And so, that's the kind of we arrive to the ship money that triggers the civil war, and even just for military expenses. And just at the end of the 17th century, you have the parliament, the English parliament, like spending 10 times more what they had rebelled for a couple of generations before. This is the degree, the scale, let's say, controversy of non-obvious, non-deterministic reality that also passes through these military engagements. Politics control these, but they are an instrument. If they succeed, they render back to politics what they have yielded. The Spanish galleons transporting wealth from the Americas were among the earliest targets for English and Dutch privateers. And this, as we've explained before, stems from the David Goliath thing. Like, the bigger power has, at large, in interest of quantity, greater cost to keep the system together. It's just physics, right? The bigger the system, the more easily it decays, and therefore the smaller but more motivated powers can capitalize upon that, and tilting the balance in favor of their sponsors. These guys would be able to loot gold coming from the Americas, but mostly bringing this back to, in fact, those who had subsidized them in order to mount up these expeditions, on which they were in fact dependent in terms of personal fortune and further wealth. This was the deep motivation. Just as, by bigger scale, like was the Spanish motivation just to keep this this, of course, back and forth going at such an enormous scale, with also the broader inland interests of controlling territories, populations, and more. And the very source of those precious metals that were, however, just the only thing there. As England's trade network expanded, adversaries such as France also increasingly engaged in privateering, a practice that persisted until the era of the Sun King. This was true again also on land. This isn't just like a naval thing, but it's interesting, in fact, to observe how different dynamics unfolded. The point is, as we explained just in the difference with terrestrial warfare, is that at sea things are even riskier, less controllable, which means that there is actually a much greater reward in case of success. I mean, things can be, by depending, like this entire intercontinental context, depending on these naval forces, are unavoidably what you must invest in, right? You can't do less even for your terrestrial army, provided that this is also adequately scaled to compete with your enemies. But at large, it's much easier to, say, call other levies and just deploying them in the front lines. With ships, it's more difficult. If anything, they take longer to be built. Then they require great maintenance costs, as we've seen. So there is all, and they're just, in fact, you can't even have too many, because as the point, the starting point is, like, there are relatively few ships for controlling this. I mean, during the 7 Years' War, basically, the Royal Navy had 130 ships of the line for this nascent global strategy. Now, it's not a few, right? It's a hell of a maritime culture and naval force that produces this, with now centuries of, in fact, experience at sea as a relevant power. But you see, with 130 ships in the world, right, you're looking at the sort of much greater imbalance compared to, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and different European countries, like, essentially establishing frontiers that were pretty much the same from centuries and centuries, because those forces were effective mostly to hold the enemy that way. Like, with the Navy, like, things are, generally speaking, more unpredictable. And in general, when you look at this also on the longer term, you realize how quick, like, the rise and fall of this global empires was compared to before. Right? This is actually due to the broader, again, acceleration and, in this sense, like, imbalances of enormous systems at home. But, like, especially the English example, the British example, is very good, because it shows, like, there was properly a devotion to the sea policy, and that was something that at some point was also surpassed without any clamorous defeat, for example. On the contrary, however, it was enough for other powers to simply strengthen. Of course, you have the major defeat of the war of U.S. independence, but that's not a defeat in the sense that the Royal Navy is not doing that anymore. There is all a glorious page in her history. But there are, since the beginning, other powers that can simply contrast that to some degree. And so the moments of peaks are temporary. And everything changes that quickly, which is something that, weirdly enough, I think as a civilization, we are pretty lazy and reticent to sort of realize. Right, we tendency would like things to remain always the way they are, but they don't. But the positive of this is that if you want, you can make them constantly better. Doesn't matter who you are. It's also the whining or the paranoia or the passive aggressiveness of those white civilizations. So, like, They must think that it has to fold, or the time of these people is over. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a deterministic, materialistic superstition for hysterical lesser people. It's not really a political analysis of strategic competence, really. In any case, I'm glad we covered this topic. Like, we're covering a lot of relatively new topics. If anything, Schwerpunkt's quality always improves over the years. That's also a thing, even though it takes like early modern naval technology its time, it's very gradual. It doesn't seem at the moment everything is changing, but over time, in the longer period, the more it goes on, sort of the better. And what I appreciate the most in general is, as the fact that for each topic we are starting to have so many other intertwined ones already, and we will keep making others. So it's always a moment of great, reorganization, recompaction, and further spread of content that will create this inescapable glue and sort of black hole from which you can't escape, gravitationally speaking. And that's how it goes. That's how it happens. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.